Metal price hikes, will they stick or not? Global manufacturing, which regions are softening and strengthening? Nick and Mike dive into these questions and more on today's Cup of Joe. It all starts now.
Hello, welcome into July's episode of Cup of Joe. I'm Mike Carrazzo, content manager at Ryerson, and I'm joined as always across the street from the office and in his own office there, Nick Webb. Nick, how you doing?
Mike, I'm doing great. How are you?
Pretty good. We've come to July already.
It's incredible. We're officially into cold brew season. It's quite hot outside these days.
Yeah, officially in the cold brew season. Exactly. Crazy things going on in the market, or not as crazy as they have been, but still have plenty to talk about. But wanted to welcome everybody to this episode of Cup of Joe. And if you, it feels like we just were talking with you, the audience, about a month ago. But in between that, Nick and I had a chance to do a special episode. We talked about it last month. It's we had a chance to write. Patrick Dempsey, I apologize. Patrick Dempsey from Nucor joined us, talking about everything from lead times to some pricing trends. And I don't know about you, Nick, but I thought it was a really good conversation, because I think it was he was very candid, very transparent about a lot of things. In particular, I liked. You had mentioned about, we talk about plate prices and sheet prices and how eventually we thought those would converge. But I thought he was pretty candid in saying, well, why would they converge? They're different markets, they're different drivers, things like that. And then kind of tongue in cheek, but in a good way. But I thought he made some really good points. That was kind of my favorite part of the interview, and how he was talking, kind of giving some transparency into some of the long-term lead times and things like that. So I really enjoyed it. I don't know, what are your thoughts from that interview?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that your favorite part of the interview was when he made me look like a dum-dum. So yeah,
exactly. Glad you run between.
But no, I mean, for those who don't know, I mean, neither Mike nor myself have spoken to Patrick ever before. So it was the first time ever getting on and having a discussion with him. And it was very candid, very open. Pretty much, every question we wanted to have answered, he discussed pretty thoroughly. So,
yep.
One thing I do want to point out, I certainly, we enjoyed the time with Nucor. By no means do we want to be biased towards any supplier or customer, and we certainly want to open up the doors to anybody, either on the customer side or I suppose competitor side or supplier side. If others have things that are going on that you want to talk about and you want to use this as a forum, we welcome all ideas. So if there are different topics, in this particular case, if you remember, the topic that kind of sparked this conversation was nuclear energy and the idea that Nucor was doing a joint venture with a small scale nuclear reactor startup to hopefully at some point get to the point where we can make, companies in the United States can make steel from nuclear power, which I thought was a pretty cool thing, pretty innovative thing. It might be years down the road, but certainly something we want to be talking about as we're thinking about forward-looking ideas here on this podcast. So if you've got any ideas, you want to come on and chat with us, we are all ears, and we want to welcome all of that.
Yeah, to that point, yeah. If you have ideas, whether it's the type of company or someone in the value chain, someone that you think would just be a good guest to come on, or a chance for us to interview in one of these special episodes, drop us a note in the chat, because we're always looking for some of these different interviews. Want to kind of expand who we're talking with, and I echo what you said. I thought he was very open, and I thought it was a fun discussion. So if you haven't had a chance to see it, everybody that is signed up for Cup of Joe should have received an email that had a link to the episode. But if not, there's our YouTube address up there. I know we say it every episode, and Nick and I were talking today. We're like, we say that, but I hope everyone knows kind of where to find us. So it's at Ryerson Metals. But if you go on YouTube and you look up Cup of Joe, we should pop up there. There's the Nucor episode with as well as the full library of every episode we've done. So if you want to go back see how many times Nick was wrong about the plate and shape discrepancies. You can do that. I kid. But yeah, just drop us a note and let's get into what's going on this month, Nick.
Yeah, before I keep getting berated by Mike, let's hop into it. So as always, we have to throw out our legal disclaimer. These are the opinions of Nick Webb, Mike Carrazzo. They are not the opinions of Ryerson. Do your own research. We've got some good content that we're going to cover. I think there's a chance we might wind up a little shorter than typical. Some of that's going to be good news, certainly for buyers of metal, because we are seeing prices come down. There's a little less chaos going on at the moment. Maybe that's a summer phenomenon. Maybe that's just where we are in the cycle relative to prior months. But I think I'll be able to give a little bit of time back to you. I say that I can talk for hours and hours about this type of stuff. So we'll see where we land. We're going to start out on the metals side of things. So I'll run through carbon, aluminum, stainless, somewhat briefly. And then we actually have a little bit more on the macro side that I want to dive into, and that'll come at the end. And then a little bit of maybe, something to keep an eye out for at the very, very end with regards to geopolitical matters. But first things first, as we often do, we like to look at U.S. steel prices relative to where North Europe is in the blue, and then Chinese prices in the orange. All three of them, as you can see, for the last several months have been headed on a downward trajectory. It's very, very hard to see, but on the far right-hand side in the white line, you'll notice there's a very tiny blip higher in the hot roll coil price. That's not a coincidence that perhaps 2 or 3 weeks ago, many of the U.S. steel mills did announce price hikes, roughly in the range of $50 per ton. They were different from mill to mill. Some of them put in a base price right around 900. Some of them said 950. But long story short, they attempted to put in place a little bit of a floor and perhaps even bring prices up. And it does look like we're seeing a little bit of price support as we sit here today. It's early days in seeing how well these price hikes will stick. But I think one other thing worth noting as we look at this chart, even though Chinese prices are at a massive discount to where U.S. prices are, they're almost half at $486, $487 per ton. It does look like ever so slightly those Chinese prices are kind of stabilizing. So maybe the worst is behind us with regards to Chinese steel prices. They make up such a large percentage of the overall steel market. They can sometimes act as a buoy for global steel prices. So we'll have to see in the coming weeks how that chart develops. But for now, it looks like they're seeing several weeks of at least a flattening of prices. And we'll get into some Chinese details here later in the discussion. With steel prices coming down and with mills continuing to ramp up, we are seeing capacity utilization moving higher domestically. Some of that is in the face of slightly higher imports, but I think it's worth noting that this import wave that we thought was maybe going to come in, say, late Q1, Q2, as domestic prices went from $700 to $1,150, $1,200 per hot roll. There was an expectation that maybe imports would start to flood into the market and then quickly correct things. It is worth noting that that import wave, they did creep up, but it wasn't by any means a wave. So I think there was really an opportunity for domestic mills to ramp production and still maintain a little bit of pricing discipline in the last couple of weeks. And I think that's probably one of the legs they have to stand on for why they think they can get a price hike put in. This is probably the biggest. Yeah, go ahead.
Audience jumped in here. I think it's a timely question. They mentioned SDI Sinton down for 2 to 4 weeks due to some equipment issues. Do you think 2+ weeks of steelmaking loss in the South might, in that area, right, will affect pricing for the near term?
I don't know if it'll impact pricing dramatically. I mean, certainly it's another leg to stand on to say that this is why we should see a bottom in prices. I think there are also a lot of difficulties coming out of the AMSA facility, which is down in Mexico. Mm-hmm. A lot of questions about how fast, how big, or even if they will ramp up production. So certainly there are some production matters in the South that are tightening things up incrementally. I don't think that means things need to rip higher. But certainly I would say slowing bleeding to the downside with regards to price.
guess it all speaks to, right, if something happens, right, so the mill's down for a few weeks, like what does that do to the volatility in the near term? So like it's kind of that subtle balancing act, I guess, if you will, across the mills, right?
For sure. I mean, there is a bit of excess capacity that you can probably go to at other mills in the region. But maybe it just pushes lead times out by a couple weeks, but shouldn't be in a situation where, you know, it's enough to really cause things to fully tighten up and cause a panic or anything like that.
Sure.
Well, what's most interesting, and I will say this does not typically happen in the steel futures curve, but I found this to be a very interesting phenomenon, and I spend a lot of my time on the risk management side dealing in the hot roll futures market. So this is a bit of a head scratcher, but if we look at the hot roll futures curve, basically at present, we have this phenomenon where, and we're going left to right as we look forward in time. So the first contract is going to be the July futures contract. The next point out on that orange curve is going to be the August futures contract. And then obviously the third one I have circled is going to be September. And you've got this phenomenon where there is an upward move, but it's not an upward move that extends really far out into the futures curve, which is what you would typically see if there's an expectation that the price hikes were going to be, you know, sticking and substantiated for a longer period of time. We have this phenomenon where the market is essentially saying, yeah, we think price hikes are going to stick for a month, maybe 2 months, but then it's going to be right back to where we were as we looked at this a month ago. And maybe even as we look out here into like November, December, there's even a suggestion that by November, December, maybe it's even worse by the time we get to that point in time. So pretty peculiar phenomenon. It's definitely a situation, and you alluded to it at the very onset, which is a lot of people in the market are trying to weigh these price hikes in the face of what looks like a somewhat consistent slowing in manufacturing activity across the world. It's not, you know, sky is falling across the world, but certainly some pockets of weakness in the manufacturing space, I think, is being weighed against the fact that, you know, as you mentioned, SDI being down but for a couple of weeks, the mills announcing price hikes and thinking that they can get those to stick for a bit. The market's basically saying, yeah, they'll stick for a little bit, but then it'll be right back to business as usual. We'll see our normal seasonal softness as we get into Q4. So pretty interesting phenomenon right now. Definitely a bit of a tug of war within the steel sheet market right now. Looking at the aluminum side of things, a month ago, I was suggesting that it looked like aluminum was holding up on a relative basis much better than some of the other markets like zinc, like nickel. Well, roll forward 30 days, another place where Nick is off. But we are seeing a little bit of a degradation or deterioration in pricing for aluminum. So as you can see, there was this support line, which I've drawn in as the white line. It was looking like it was holding for a fairly decent period of time. We've now broken below that as we've gotten much weaker European data, which we'll touch on here in a little bit. And I'd say underwhelming data within China, and maybe a little bit of underwhelming data here within North America. Those things all kind of packaged together is just continuing this slight malaise, this bit of bearishness as we sit here in the middle of summer. So basis the LME aluminum contract, we're now down below $1 per pound. So it's just kind of a slow, controlled bleed to the downside in prices for aluminum. We will at some point start to test, at least for some producers of aluminum, if we get down into the mid to low 90-cent range. I would argue that with higher labor costs, still some regions that are having higher energy costs, we would start to test the cost curves of producers if we get down into the low 90-cent range. So I think that's an area where I'd start to say we could see some supply coming out offline just because they can't make aluminum profitably anymore. But that probably is the next real fundamental catalyst for where things would bottom. Outside of that, for now, it looks like things are fairly soft and squishy within the manufacturing space. And as we look at the commitment of traders report, which is basically saying how long or short, or in other words, how bullish or bearish are traders, aluminum traders have moved a little more to the negative side in the last 30 days. So that would be, that would be reflected within the price of aluminum, certainly as we head to the downside, as more and more traders put on short positioning to try and profit from a downside move. Similar story on nickel. I would say we've probably been, Mike, have been a little more negative on the stainless market and on the nickel market in particular. And I drew in this channel, which interestingly enough seems to be really kind of the story for the last several months, which is we seem to be in a downward move as the market becomes more and more oversupplied, particularly in class 2 nickel from Indonesia. But really on a global basis, we're seeing stainless markets a little incrementally softer and looser than certainly carbon and a bit weaker than aluminum at the moment. So that is being reflected in the price of nickel. I mentioned on the aluminum side, this idea of cost curves and where we might find support. One of the issues with nickel is the cost support, at least from reading I've done, really doesn't come into play for another probably 15–20% until it really starts to dig into the cost curve. So it wouldn't be totally shocking if until or unless we see something coming out of China from a stimulus standpoint, or much better data coming out of the manufacturing sector here within North America. It wouldn't totally shock me to see this continuation of the channel as we roll through the next couple months in time. Worth noting, in the last couple of days, we have seen a little bit of a jolt higher in the price of nickel. It doesn't look like a lot just because we've seen so much volatility in the price of nickel. I still think that that's more just a blip than it is a real fundamental change in the story for nickel prices or nickel markets globally. And as we look at the commitment of traders for that market, it really does kind of reflect that story, which is traders are continuing to get a little more incrementally bearish. It's not a massive position to the short side, but it is slightly bearish as we look at where traders are positioned on the short side of things.
What do you think for stainless steel prices in general for the remainder of the year? Again, what should stainless buyers be on the lookout for?
Yeah, I mean, I think unlike what I was talking about in carbon, where it does seem like imports are pretty subdued, and really the pricing in most carbon flat roll imports isn't really all that compelling, isn't all that attractive. It certainly doesn't, at least in my eyes, warrant taking a ton of long-term price risk on bringing in foreign product in a big degree, maybe in spots. Mm-hmm. But in the stainless steel world, I would say that's a little bit of a different story, where whether it's in Asian markets or in European markets, the stainless markets are a little better supplied, and certainly we're seeing discounted prices in the foreign space on stainless. So I think that stainless import numbers are going to be a little more robust, not in a massive way, but a little more robust than what we're seeing in other markets. So all things being equal, that probably leads to a slightly, softening, dampening of stainless steel markets.
Makes sense. Okay.
Which is, I mean, it's been a long time coming. Stainless steel markets for the better part of 3 years they've been, particularly on the base side, have been very, very stable and certainly elevated. I'm not saying, what goes up must come down necessarily, but it's had one heck of a ride, one heck of a stable ride, really, from a pricing standpoint. Yeah. And it looks like that's beginning to soften just incrementally. So getting into the macro side of things, this is actually a chart or a graph or visual that our intern, shout out to Rebecca, came across just yesterday. It's depicting the same data that we always track within that heat map, where we look at all the different regions of the world. It's the exact same data, just shown visually. So for those who are geographically inclined, maybe this is something you like seeing a little better than just numbers on a screen. But I think it's a really cool visual for a number of reasons. One is it shows what we've been depicting numerically, just visually. And the other thing that I think that it shows is you can see the geographic and regional disparities. As you look at different pockets of the world, you can kind of see how there does seem to be a little bit of clumping effect in manufacturing activity. What I would note, I guess, right off the bat would be the deep red in Europe. That's one that we've been highlighting for the last several months. European data, particularly in the manufacturing side, is quite weak. And I would say they're certainly leading the path of the globe into what looks like could be sort of a hard landing or more traditional type recession. German data, French data, we're in the low 40s on PMIs for that region. Switch over to the US over on the left-hand side. for those who don't know where America is. And the data is moving a little bit deeper into the red territory. So I think the exact number was in the mid 46 range for the United States. So that is incrementally softening on a month-over-month basis. When you shift over into some of the Asian markets and maybe Middle East, there are some interesting pockets of strength. We've talked in prior months about the idea that Russia is, at least per the data, per the surveys, is holding up incrementally okay with PMIs coming in over 50. India's been a standout for the better part of a year and look like there's nothing stopping them. I think we've highlighted this in the past, but it seems as though India is really benefiting from the fact that there is cheap energy out there floating around, really on the backs of mostly Europe blocking or banning some of that product. India is kind of welcoming a lot of that discounted product with open arms. And then, you know, as you look in the center of the chart, interestingly enough, the manufacturing data in Turkey looks okay, despite the fact that they have really high inflation data. And then Saudi Arabia and I think that's the UAE, both showing some pretty positive data as well. Worth noting, I think we have to highlight the fact that even though China is sitting in neutral territory, I would say that is underwhelming relative to what expectations have been for the last 6 months or so. So it's not bad news necessarily in China. It's just not as good as what many analysts within the commodity space were thinking or hoping. And I'd say myself included in that. I was expecting there to be a little more robust recovery as they exited those lockdowns. But yeah, I thought this was a pretty interesting visual. So thank you, Rebecca, for sending this through.
We got a few questions from the audience on this chart. Agree, it's you know, this is in place of that the eye chart you've had right over. And this is kind of nice because it shows a nice visualization of where things are globally and kind of point out trends. One question from the audience is, what effect do you think nearshoring in the last 6 months will have on this growth in general?
Yeah, I think there are some real elements of nearshoring. Obviously, they're going to take some time to play out, but I do think there are some short-term elements of nearshoring that we are seeing where that's going to benefit mostly, I would say, North America. I think there's also a phenomenon whereby I think there are some real fundamental issues. Like I mentioned the fact that Europe is getting more difficult in sourcing, you know, reliable energy needs. And I think some of that is forcing the hand of saying, well, if we're going to produce something, let's take it to North America or ramp up production in places that have a little more reliable energy sources. So whether it's for geopolitical reasons or for just fundamental, you know, raw material needs options, then I think some of this phenomenon is taking place. Longer term, I think the nearshoring phenomenon is going to be much more of a slow play, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the future. And some of that's going to be aided by the fact that we've got federal spending plans, infrastructure bills, the Inflation Reduction Act, that in some ways mandate domestic product to be utilized, which I think inherently nearshores or has the idea of a nearshoring type effect. Yeah.
And I have to ask, you mentioned India, and they've been showing strength past few months that we've been talking about this too. And there was the news, right, that U.S. just lifted the tariffs on steel and aluminum coming in from India. Do you think that plays further into? I mean, it seems like, you know, their manufacturing strengthening up now. This is happening. It just seems like they're continuing growing presence here in this global economy.
Yeah, I mean, my boss and I were talking about this just a little bit ago, and I mean, India now is the most populous country in the entire world, and they're showing, whether you want to use GDP or whether you want to use PMIs, whatever metric you want to use, they're growing at, I'd say, high single digits, low double digit type growth figures. This has the potential, and this isn't something that probably takes place over the next 2-3 years, but this is maybe more of a 5, 10, 15 year phenomenon. India's got some of the makings to be sort of what China would have been, let's say, in the early 90s through 2010, which was a massive bull market of just bringing a lot of people out of lower middle class into more of a middle class, upper class situation, which, as many people on this call may know, that caused commodity bull markets in pretty much everything in the mid 2000s. We saw, you know, nickel prices go to record highs. We saw steel prices go to record highs. And a lot of that was in the face of a big slowdown with the great financial crisis during that time. I'm not necessarily here to say that India is going to do the exact same formula or playbook, because China did a lot of that with very large stimulus packages. They kind of shot a bazooka at their economy. India seems to be a little more slow playing on the approach. But yeah, I mean, geopolitically or geographically, I do think India is going to be a very important linchpin in geopolitics, because I think they're becoming a bigger and bigger player and a more powerful player every year we roll forward in the future. And you maybe we're going to go on to this, but Prime Minister Modi was just recently in Washington, D.C. in the last couple of weeks negotiating trade deals. And I think part of that was the U.S. kind of said, we won't keep pestering your metals industry. And they kind of responded back and said, we'll open up some of the trade barriers to U.S. agricultural products, probably for some reason because they need it to feed, their growing population and their rapidly wealthy or increasing wealth of their population. They need more and more food. But yeah, I think there's certainly going to be an important piece in the puzzle of maintaining good trade relationships.
Yeah, certainly interesting.
Did I answer your question? I got a little worried there.
No, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, all good.
Excellent. So if you were hoping to not have numbers in the discussion today, bad news, we've got it here. This is basically the same data as the prior, but it's really honing in on the United States, and it's looking at a different data source, this one being the Institute of Supply Management. They're basically doing the same thing that the S&P survey is doing, but they tend to break it down at a little more line item basis. And worth noting, unfortunately, as we look in the June index column, every single one of the sub indices, whether we look at the headline number, new orders, even employment, every one of these indices is now below 50, which is suggestive of a contracting manufacturing economy. And perhaps further worth noting, down in the bottom right corner, it's not just contracting, it's actually contracting at a slightly faster pace. It's not to say that every subsector of the economy is weakening at a recessionary type pace, but on a holistic, broad sense, it certainly looks like the data is beginning to plateau and soften a little bit. And this has been the case for a number of months at this point. You can see in the far bottom right corner, this trend of softer growth and contracting growth within the U.S. manufacturing world has been taking place for the better part of a year at this point. Now, on the opposite side of that, it's just amazing how resilient the services side of the economy is. This is looking at the same data provider, the Institute of Supply Management, but it's looking at the services economy. This data just came out today and showed a pretty significant uptick in the services side of the economy. So we do have a scenario whereby things like travel, leisure, hospitality, perhaps technological services are performing at a growth clip. So this looks like a decent bright spot within the economy for now. Now you can see the general trend still looks like it's headed on a longer term basis somewhere towards 50, but this move higher did surprise some people, and we'll talk about some of those implications here in just a couple slides. As we flip over to China and look at some of the same data, what we're looking at here is going to be the white line. So the white, not the horizontal white line at the 0 mark, that's just to show growth versus weakness. If we look at the white line that's kind of moving around, that is going to be Chinese investment in infrastructure. The blue line is Chinese infrastructure growth in manufacturing, and the orange line is Chinese investment in real estate. And the reason why we want to break it down this way is because it is really kind of a tale of two different economies. And maybe we might even be seeing a little bit of this phenomenon within North America right now, where manufacturing is in the weakening territory and services is in a growth situation. It's something kind of like that within China right now. And they've been fairly open in the last couple of weeks in saying, if we're going to stimulate our economy, we want to do it in places that are quality growth, and they seem to be defining quality growth as things that are more technologically oriented, things that are more manufacturing oriented, certainly taking the emphasis off of people owning 4 or 5 different residences. So the real estate sector is where they're kind of leaving that to the side. part of the issue with that, or part of the concern within the commodities world of that, is the Chinese real estate sector makes up one of the biggest components of the overall market over there. You have a lot of people who have a very large percentage of their wealth tied up in their homes. And so unfortunately, because they're kind of leaving that piece of the market out, it is certainly acting as a drag. But it is worth noting that it's not across the board that we're seeing the weakness. It's just that where they're looking to target their infrastructure spends or their stimulus spends is more in the infrastructure side, technology side, and services economies. So it is kind of a tale of two different economies, certainly in China, and as you can see in this chart. And maybe you can make the argument that we're even seeing a little bit of that in the United States. And as we talk about the services economy and travel and leisure, we talked about this chart last month, but I wanted to bring it up again because we did, in fact, officially hit the highest on record. And this is not just post-COVID, this is ever TSA checkpoint data. So this is the number of US passengers going through the TSA checkpoint, and it hit right around 2.9 million people. So that would have been as of June 30th. So if we're calling for a recession, I will say that this data point very much so goes in the face of that, which is saying people are still very much so spending money on getting out, moving around, some of that certainly for business purposes, some of that for leisure purposes. But this certainly goes in the face of some of that cooling manufacturing data.
That was even before the 4th of July weekend, where there was reported the airports heavy traffic, a lot of highway travel, right? It's very interesting.
Yeah, and worth noting, and we'll touch on jobs here in just a second. I mean, this is all in the face of what I think looks like a much leaner airport industry or airline industry. Okay. So I think that's part of the phenomenon as to why we saw so many delays and cancellations and things like that, because the airlines and airports are basically doing way more with way less in terms of the human element.
So this is showing us that despite talks of a recession, right, people are still traveling more. They're spending leisure dollars. This is kind of what we're getting at here, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I can't necessarily say this is true in every city, but certainly as you look across some of the largest cities in the U.S., we're here in Chicago. You go out to bars and restaurants, and they are packed to the gills. And again, I don't want to be tone deaf in saying that inflation and cooling markets isn't hurting certain pockets of the United States, but it certainly seems like the restaurant industry is still thriving quite well right now.
And an audience member chimes in here to maybe compare credit card debt increases against leisure boom in one of these coming episodes to see if that's indeed true. So a good point there from one of our viewers.
Yeah, and fair point. I think when you look at credit card balances, they are at record high levels, and that's on a nominal basis. And the reason why I say that is if you take that one step further and compare that to wage growth, wages are also going up. So I think it's a more difficult story than just saying credit is going up, because people are also making more money now with wage growth tracking right around 5-6%. So it's an issue and may become a bigger issue as we roll through time, particularly as interest rates go up. Those debt burdens and interest burdens may continue to grow. But for now, it's not causing the issues to the travel and leisure world just yet. Mm-hmm. But fair point, audience member.
Yeah.
I mean, these next couple slides really are the reason why I think debt and interest payments aren't yet biting the way we would have thought they would have, and perhaps the way Jay Powell would have thought they would have, because we are still seeing, despite the fact that we've seen the fastest rate hike cycle in the history of the Federal Reserve, we are still seeing unemployment rates at 3.7%, which is right down near 20-year lows. So people who are looking for jobs can get them, and it's a very lean labor market. It is worth noting, I don't have a chart on this, but the JOLTS job opening data did tick a little lower. But counteracting that, it is worth noting as well today, the jobs data coming from ADP, it beat expectations by about double. I think expectations were about 225. I think the actual number came in at 490,000 people. So that could be that could explain a bit of why we're seeing the JOLTS data come down, because those jobs are actually getting filled with people. A lot of that is in travel and leisure and hospitality. So I don't know if that's people working at bars, restaurants, or airlines, something like that. But But nonetheless, jobs are good. Wages, wage growth is holding up well for now. So again, the jobs picture is one of the absolute bright spots within the North American economy. And one other trend that I don't think we've talked about before, maybe we've highlighted it just anecdotally. This is coming from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. And the white line or the white dash is basically showing where they had forecasted retirement. And this is arguably retirement of baby boomers. So as baby boomers get further and further into their life cycle or their career cycle, obviously there's an expectation that the percentage of overall workers would become retired people just because there's such a big portion of the population. Well, when we got COVID lockdowns, the phenomenon, and this has been written about, I know, but I think it's worth noting or showing visually that the lockdowns and maybe the frustration in the workforce or just kind of giving up in the workforce did cause a much larger percentage of the population to go to the sidelines and essentially call early retirement or just retirement in general. And if you just kind of eyeball it, it looks like it's exceeded the forecast by, let's call it 1% to 1.5%. But that's of the entire working, workforce of the United States. So if we say half the United States, put it roughly 150 million people, 1% of that's 1.5 million people that left the job market. So whether that's, nurses, doctors, pilots, flight attendants, whatever it may be, there's certainly a tightness in the labor side of the equation. And this is at least part of that equation that's causing some of that. So again, jobs market looks quite strong, and this is at least part of the reason why that may be. Lastly, before we start talking about the Fed and what the Fed may be doing with interest rates later this month, this is looking at inflation data. I know we've looked at this in the past, but it's looking at CPI, Consumer Price Index, in the white line. The blue line is going to be PPI, so kind of a wholesale producer price index, which interestingly has gone into negative territory as we sit here today. So that is not just disinflation, that is deflation at the PPI level. But what's interesting, I did want to highlight this, and I don't want to just be a bearer of bad news or anything like that, but I think it's worth noting the Fed has at different points in time said that the PCE, which is personal consumption expenditures, that the core PCE, so core meaning they're taking out food and energy prices, they've said in the past that this is their favorite index to watch on whether or not they should be taking interest rates higher or lower. And it is worth noting that line has pretty much flatlined. And unfortunately, it's flatlined at 4.6%, which is only 125 basis points off the high. So 1.25% off the high. That means that core inflation really is not reacting the way the Fed was hoping it would. And I think part of that is going to be wages. The jobs market is still just so strong. Part of that's going to be shelter. And so this is proving to be a little more resilient than I think the Fed had hoped. And for that reason, and for just, a lot of these positive elements within the jobs world, the expectation now, and I should have highlighted this, but if we look up here in the top middle, that is the current probability of basically whether the market thinks the Fed is going to hike interest rates. So 88.8% chance that they are going to continue hiking interest rates after a pause in the last meeting. So that would take rates not basically from 5.25% up to 5.5%. And it would just continue this tightening cycle that the Fed would, if that is the case, if that is how it plays out, and it looks fairly likely at this stage that is how it's going to play out. It's the Fed essentially saying not enough things have cooled off to the extent that we wanted them to, so we're going to continue tightening the reins a little bit. And so it's kind of a phenomenon where good news in jobs data, good news in services data is probably going to be reflected with further tightening from the Fed, because whether we like it or not, that's not what they want to see. They don't want to see that jobs are continuing to be robust and employment rates are continuing to be at 20-year lows. I know it sounds perverse, but they are actively trying to get this core inflation rate, I would argue, this core inflation rate somewhere much closer to 2%, and it's not yet reacting at this stage. So looks like more rate hikes to come, which unfortunately probably just means incrementally It's going to be a little more expensive to do business. It's going to be a little more expensive to borrow, to buy a car or buy a house, because all of this is going to impact borrowing rates and mortgage rates as well.
And I'm sorry, Nick, but we're one that PCE, the Personal Consumption Index, PCI, Personal Consumption Expenditures, right?
Yep.
By it flatlining, what does that tell us in comparison to the PPI?
Yeah, so I should be careful in saying that it's flatlining, because flatlining would be that prices are actually plateauing. In reality, when we think about inflation rates, and I actually sometimes think the market doesn't appreciate this fully, a CPI of 4.04 or a PCE number of 4.6, sure, the trajectory is coming down, but that does not mean that prices are coming down. Unfortunately, it just means that the price increases are slowing. So all of 4.6% PCE, essentially flatlining, as I said it, all that means is we're continuing to see 4.6% price increases in goods. So yeah, I use the word flatline. It's actually a little bit of a misnomer, because it actually means that we're continuing to see prices go up at a fairly decent clip. 4.6% is a fairly robust number.
Sure. Okay. Makes
so
sense.
it's basically just a continuation of prices going up. A bit of good news from the banking sector. I think maybe 2-3 months ago, I maybe made too bold of a call, and I said, we may see further failures of banks, and I still personally tend to believe that there might be some pain in the banking sector. But a bit of good news here, as I take a step back from the ledge, the white line is going to be the level of deposits. And by the way, I've normalized both of these charts just to show the relative moves of them. But it's showing deposits at commercial banks. The blue line is going to show the amount of money in money market funds. So that's basically high yielding, or it's your ability to access the treasury market and get the current rate that the government is paying, which is right around 5.25%. So as rates have gone up and up and up, a lot of people have looked at their bank accounts at JP Morgan or Wells Fargo or wherever it may be and said, why in the world do I have my cash sitting here when I'm getting 25 basis points when the market rate is 500 basis points or 5%? So there was a phenomenon for a number of months, and this is part of what caused the issues back in February and March. People said, no mas, I'm taking my money out of the banks. I'm putting them either at more established institutions, maybe I'm putting cash under my pillow, or in this case, what actually did happen is they moved them into money market funds where they were generating much higher levels of interest payments. And you can see that phenomenon pretty clearly here. Since basically Q4 of 2020, there's been a large move of bank deposits out of banks and into these types of investment vehicles. That's good news for the consumer who's trying to get more and more interest into their own hands. It's bad news for the banks. The good news in the last couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months, is the fact that it does look like this run of bank deposits has stabilized for now. And similarly, even the data within the money market funds, as money's gone into those higher yielding vehicles versus banks, it looks like that phenomenon is also leveling out a little bit. So this is certainly something that the bank executives are watching. They're hoping that this trend continues. I think, as we sit here today in early July, we are going to be heading into earnings season for Q2. Starting, I think, right around July 14th, we're going to get a lot of bank earnings. So we're going to hear from the big publicly traded banks. And I think we're going to learn a lot about the banking sector at that point in time. So, if they come out and say they're seeing a continuation, in fleeing of deposits and they're struggling to make earnings, we might see a little more pain ahead. If they say this trend, it looks like it's over and people have settled down, they have confidence in the banking sector, then it could be clear skies ahead. But I think we're going to have to, we'll be digging into the bank earnings pretty deeply, and as will market participants, to try and determine, what's going to happen in the coming months for the banking world. Again, a bit of bright spots, because I know I've talked about just, how across the board, manufacturing has been cooling. I do want to highlight the fact that there are some sectors of the economy that actually are holding up pretty well. This one in particular is mainly looking at the automotive world. So it's looking at light vehicle sales in the white line, which is shown on the left axis. So it's tracking right around 15.7 million units per year. On the right-hand side, you've got heavy truck sales. So this is just a glimpse into some of the industries that actually are holding up quite well. And maybe the heavy truck world's getting a little bit of a tailwind from federal spending and some of the bills that have been passed. But nonetheless, these things are holding up quite well. We're hearing that aerospace is doing fairly well. Certainly new home starts, so construction into building new homes. That world is doing fairly well at this point, which is interesting given where interest rates and mortgage rates are. But it follows this phenomenon that there's just such tight supply and availability of homes that they've got to be built then. If people aren't willing to sell, they aren't willing to move. Anybody getting into the housing market right now, they're looking at new builds, and new builds are becoming a quickly growing part of the overall housing market as we sit here today, which is an interesting and surprising phenomenon. But I did want to make sure I highlighted a couple of bright spots because they do exist for sure right now.
I could attest to the fact that new vehicles are still very hard to get. My wife and I are trying to trade in one of our cars and get something specific, and you can't find things. I mean, things are you're still having to look pretty hard and long for cars. So I mean, that's maybe speaking to the positive of this market too a little bit.
You in the market for the new Cybertruck?
No, unfortunately not.
I was going to say, because they haven't actually started mass producing those, that's why you can't get it.
Exactly. Yes.
Last but not least, and this, I don't want to be a fearmonger or anything, but it is worth noting that in the last week, China stepped forward and said that starting in August, they are going to put export restrictions. So it's not a ban, but export restrictions on gallium and germanium. And if those sound like metals that Ryerson sells, they are not. I am not a gallium or germanium expert, but I do like to follow geopolitics fairly quickly. And I will say that this is a slight escalation of tensions between China and really the rest of the world. And the reason for that is because gallium, and again, Rebecca, thank you for the help on this. Gallium makes up, so 80% of the gallium market is comprised within China. 60% of the germanium market is in China. I'm showing these pie charts of more broadly looking at rare earths because that's, gallium and germanium are in that bucket. Certainly the piece of the pie that China has within the rare earth space is well known. It's very notable. It's one that we certainly in the Western world want to figure out ways to alleviate this risk, because there is a risk that as we become more and more reliant on things like semiconductors and electronics, these products do consume, at least for now, large quantities of rare earth metals. And with China being such a large piece of that, they know that they have a little bit of control on that hose, on that spigot if they want. If they want to put a kink in that supply chain, they can. And so this isn't, they're not breaking the markets. There are other ways to make semiconductors and electronics. There are North American sources, there are European sources. They aren't as large, admittedly. But some of the rhetoric coming out of both China and the United States does appear, unfortunately, to be escalating, not de-escalating. And they're even subsequent to that announcement from China. And again, it's all related to semiconductors for the most part. The United States came forward and said that we were thinking about putting a ban on high-end semiconductors for like artificial intelligence, which we talked about last month. And even the notion that there'd be a possibility of banning services companies of doing business with China, which it's a little more vague, but it's a little more aggressive in saying that essentially if you're a consulting company or you're a technological services company like a Google or Amazon or something like that, they're basically saying we are considering banning your ability to go into that region. So the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because unfortunately some of these geopolitical tensions still appear to be more in escalation mode than they do de-escalation mode. So as we think about durable supply chains, even though all of this is around rare earths, similar statements can be made within base metals, ferrous metals as well. So, keep an ear to the ground on some of these geopolitical matters, because they're certainly growing in rhetoric. In substance, we'll see. Hopefully not too much, because that could cause some more bottlenecks as we roll through time. But I wanted to bring that up just because that's pretty recent, fresh news on the semi side.
So in a sense, saying that this could maybe have, it's at a small scale, but maybe at a larger scale could eventually hit larger supply chain issues.
It certainly right? Could. I mean, we saw a glimpse of it, probably would have been about 2 years ago, when there was a magnesium blockage or magnesium shortage. It may or may not have been purposeful, but when China was having its power issues, they rightly or wrongly decided to ratchet down their production of magnesium. Magnesium, as some on the call may know, is a very important alloying ingredient into aluminum. So you had this situation where it was almost like a chaos theory situation, where a rare earth metal or a rarer metal of magnesium had a knock-on effect to the production of aluminum in certain parts of the world. So that's really where these sort of things that we never really spend much time thinking about can have knock-on implications to much bigger and broader industries.
Right. Interesting. Good to think about. As always, great stuff, Nick. Good overview. Things are a little all over the place when it comes to the manufacturing world, and certainly some things to look at. Let's we're getting some questions here from the audience. Can we go back to the ISM PMI slide for a moment, if you will?
Of course we can.
Viewer, any thoughts on why customer inventory switched what appears to be hard from too high to too low? So basically a hard switch from being very high to now very low.
Well, I guess I don't know whether the customers on the individuals on the customer side or the Ryerson side, but I'll just speak kind of holistically. I think as we've seen, and as we talked about in the last couple, Joe, we ran through the supply chain pressure index, which is basically saying, is it hard or difficult to get things? And what's happened is it's gone from being the hardest it ever was to get things to roughly the easiest it's been in the last 20 years to get things. And that's not true across every industry. It's not true across every end market. But in general, things have gotten back to normal, I think is a fair assessment to say. As that happens, the phenomenon that we're seeing is, I think service centers are believing that they can live a little more, maybe not hand to mouth, but certainly with lighter inventories. I think customers are realizing the exact same thing, which is they don't need safety stock. The idea of having to have 6 months of inventory, maybe a thing of the past in most markets, maybe not all markets, but in most markets. So this idea that instead of having or needing to have 6 months worth of metal, maybe they're ratcheting that down to 2 months or a month. That's causing inventory levels to deplete very, very rapidly. And I think there's a similar phenomenon as you go further and further up the supply chain. Service centers then react to that by saying, well, if they don't need as much inventory, well, then we don't need to hold as much inventory on hand for them, because we may be able to go out on an easier basis and get something with a short lead time, maybe 4, 6, 8 weeks on most metal products. That's using metals as an example, but I think that's the phenomenon that's happened.
Gotcha. Okay. Question here about what if anything is going on with transportation costs, logistical costs.
For now, they're holding steady at trough levels. Similar to the supply chain pressure index, the logistical costs, the cost to get a flatbed truck, they have come down fairly rapidly, and maybe not to the extent of the overall pressure index, which has gone into some of the loosest markets we've seen, but it's definitely at much more normalized levels. So kind of business as usual pre-COVID.
And got a fan from the past bringing up Dr. Copper. Anything going on there? Because it's usually, as you said in the past, right? It could be it's a PhD in kind of determining the direction of the market, right? Back to Dr.
That's
Copper.
right.
So what is the doctor telling us right now?
Yeah, copper incrementally, and I'm probably going to regret saying this in a month, but copper incrementally is holding up better than most of the other base metals. So if you look at aluminum, nickel, zinc, copper is holding up better. And I think part of that phenomenon isn't necessarily the fact that it thinks the world economy is doing great, but I think it's a little bit of the phenomenon that as more and more of these initiatives, whether it's China trying to focus on quality growth, or if it's the United States enacting, federal spending bills to put in charging stations, a lot of these initiatives are far more copper intensive than they are other products. So we are seeing weakness in price. We are seeing, some of the same phenomenon that's going on in nickel prices, aluminum prices is also happening in copper, but copper appears to be a little more resilient just because I think the demand picture, which is being somewhat subsidized by government spending, is very heavily targeted into that copper specific space. So whether it's charging stations, EVs, electrical grids, I think the electrification of the world definitely is more copper intensive for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Question about reshoring. Has the trend contributed to the ongoing reduction of imports, or are buyers worried offshore material won't be as competitive versus domestic spot prices by the time it reaches the port?
I guess I'll just speak to metals because I don't have a great grasp on like broader products per se, but if we're just looking at metals, I don't think it's necessarily reshoring that has kept prices import levels subdued, because as I mentioned, we are seeing a situation whereby imports of stainless steel are going up from here, not down, and that's an economic function. So yeah, I do believe reshoring is real. I do believe more and more businesses shifting to reliable supply chains, but a lot of these companies that are importing product are still in the business of making money and being profitable. And if there's a compelling reason to do something and it's legal to do so, and it's not cost prohibitive or risk prohibitive, then we'll do it. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're still seeing or beginning to see rather stainless steel imports coming up, just because the pricing is warranted to do so. In the case of carbon, I'd say no real change in the aluminum space to a notable degree. On the carbon side of things, I think there's more of a phenomenon of there's a lack of foreign cost competitive options right now, which is sort of surprising given the fact that there's what I think is weakness in Asia, weakness in Europe. There are import offers available. They just aren't all that competitive to US prices. And I think the alternative to that is you've got more and more domestic supply ramping up. So it's becoming easier and shorter lead time to get it domestically. So that's helping to keep things localized. And a lot of that was kind of the point of 232, was to really build back the domestic steel industry. And that's not intended to be a political statement or anything, but I do think that is an end result. You get a much more consolidated industry that can kind of pull the levers more quickly, more effectively. And that's helped to bring more of the steel production domestic.
Okay. Yeah, well said. I'm going to slip one in here right at the buzzer. Any anticipation that with the instability going on in France, any supply chain risks or concerns anticipating down the road for that?
I mean, if you're buying products specifically from France, I think there could be some risk to that. I think, I mean, Europe's just a bit of a mess right now, because they are having riots in Germany, but I mean, German manufacturing activity is pretty weak as well. So, no, not massively, but yeah, I think Europe's just got some struggles they need to work through for the next foreseeable future.
Yep. Yeah. All right. Well, we're up against the wire here. We had some more questions coming in too. So lively audience this month. We appreciate all the questions all the time. I mean, it keeps Nick on his toes, keeps the conversation flowing. If we don't get to him, we'll certainly follow up with an answer. And every Tuesday following Cup of Joe, the email comes out that the full episode's available. It's available on our YouTube channel, which we noted by the following Monday. But if you're signed up to attend Cup of Joe, you should be receiving an email with all the latest. And with that, Nick, just leave us with a key takeaway for July as we head into August now.
No, I think we talked about this maybe a year and a half ago. I said there will be a time where news flow will be a little more calm on a relative basis, and we will welcome that when it comes. I'm not saying things are absolutely calm. We still have plenty of things going on in the world today. But I think we're in calmer times than we've seen for the last 2 or 3 years. So It's summertime. Hope everyone enjoys it. And if you've got guests or ideas you want to talk about in subsequent shows, keep us in the loop, and we look forward to doing this again here in a month.
Sounds great, Nick. And we'll see everyone next month.
Hey, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.